You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
All right, we are back again for another fascinating episode of in-depth discussion of topics related to creation and origins. Paul, we started this, 2 years ago almost now, and I'm amazed that we continue to have new ideas for episodes. You'd think we'd eventually run out of things to talk about when we're focused on just 11 chapters of Genesis. You'd think, how long can they talk? But here we are.
So we haven't run out of topics yet.
No,
I think we've got lots of ideas for episodes coming up. So,
yeah, it's pretty good. So we're actually starting a new series today. And this one is going to be different than the other series. We're going to try to knock these episodes out in succession, one after the other. No intermittent things, no returning to things and showing you other episodes in between. We're just going to do this one at a time. So if this bores you, I'm sorry, come back in 2 months and we'll go on to another subject. But I hope it doesn't bore you. I hope this is exciting and interesting because I think it's really quite fascinating and relevant and important. So, and our subject is, to put it in simple terms, how much of the rock record, how much of the fossil record, right, was produced by the flood during the actual year of the flood. And to kind of put another way, what parts of the fossil record, what layers of rock should we actually say this was deposited by the flood? And this is a subject that has been discussed among creation-minded geologists for, well, basically as long as there's been geology. This is nothing new, as we will see. So people have been talking about this for a long time. It is still a topic of discussion in the modern world of creationists. There's a lot of paleontologists who have one particular idea about how the flood boundary, the boundary between the flood and the post-flood rocks, how that should be defined. And there are other people who have very different and strongly held opinions about the same subject. So it's been an interesting time watching from afar. I am not a paleontologist myself. I am not a geologist. I know enough to be dangerous and say things that make me sound smart, but I have no idea what they mean. So people say this is where the flood boundary should be, and I think, well, okay. I'll just take that as an operating assumption. I think people think that I have a strong opinion on this subject, and I think they'd be surprised. I don't really know, and I can see things go in different ways. So there it is. That's basically what we're going to discuss. So the format, I'll just spoil it for you now. We're going to talk to Paul here in a second about all of these sorts of issues and how we might think about these questions. And him and I are going to try to set up sort of the history of the discussion, where we are now, and sort of what things to think about and listen for as the series progresses. Then we're going to have 2 episodes in a row. One episode is going to be an interview with a geologist who holds one view of the fossil record. And the one after that is going to be an interview with a geologist who holds a different perspective on the fossil record. So these are going to be 2 creationists, 2 flood geologists. They believe that the flood caused a lot of the geologic column, but they're going to have different ideas about precisely what rocks belong to that year-long flood and what rocks might have been deposited later on. And we're deliberately separating them into separate episodes because we're just that kind of guy. We just feel like we want to give people an opportunity to have their say. I think, your average podcast would probably get them both on at the same time and let them go at each other like some sort of cockfighting ring or something. And I just feel like, you know what? I want to actually hear one guy just clearly enough that I can digest and think about what they're telling me. And so I can think through these issues more carefully. And we hope that you're going to feel that same way as you hear these episodes or watch these episodes. And then, after those two interviews, we're going to come back for a fourth wrap-up episode. And I'm not sure what's going to be in that episode, other than me and Paul are going to just chat about what we've learned and how we've changed our attitude, what our attitude actually is, maybe what our position is. I'm not sure. It's just going to be Paul and I reflecting on what we've learned for those episodes. So that's going to be how this is going to go. And it's going to be, 4 episodes right in a row. And no, we're not going to tell you who the interviewees are. You're going to have to come back and be surprised. But I promise you it will be worth your attention when it comes around to those episodes. Because we're not just interviewing any old chumps here. We're gonna try to get the best and the brightest, I guess. I don't know. All right, so Paul, let's begin, if we could. I don't know, at the beginning. so yeah.
Sounds a good place.
Yeah, rewind it way back for us. We're back, let's say, in the 1700s, the end of the 1700s. People have been making observations for a while about rocks and where they occur and layers of rocks and what they're like and so forth. We've finally, the end of the 1700s, we're sort of still, I would say, my understanding of it is that the majority of scholars of those days would understand fossils to be the remnants of formerly living things, but there's still some discussion about that. So it may surprise viewers and listeners, our audience members, to know that fossils have not always been understood to be the actual remnants of living things. So this was a thing that early scholars sort of had to decide at some point that, these things that look like bones were actually bones at one time and were left in this rock and got turned into rock, and now they're fossils. So there you are, at sort of the end of the 1700s. People are starting to do what we would think of as stratigraphy, where they're studying actual layers of rock. And can you fill us in a little bit on what's going on at that time and why, and who are these scriptural geologist people that we hear a lot about as we come into the 19th century?
Yeah. So
there's a lot there. I know.
It's a good place to be. This is such a contentious question.
Yeah,
and I think as we're about to discover, it's been an issue of debate for a very long time. And it's not a trivial question. This is a really important part of developing any flood model, is trying to decide, which are the flood rocks, which are the post-flood rocks, and so on. And it actually affects how we think about lots of other topics. Of course, it affects how we think about the scale and intensity of post-flood catastrophism, and what we think happened to the ark animals, when they came off the ark, and all kinds of other topics. So it's really important. And we find, as we go back to that time that you're talking about, there's this group of kind of proto-flood geologists, if you like, called the Scriptural Geologists or the Mosaic Geologists. They're a pretty disparate group, naturalists and clergymen and other scholars. I guess you can think of these guys being active from the period about 1820 to about 1860. Some may have operated a bit outside of that time, but they're essentially reacting to the new theories that were emerging in geology. Now, the science of geology was quite a young science. So geology was, we'd had the theories of Hutton and Lyell, the theories of uniformitarianism, Hutton in the 1780s. Lyell was popularizing these ideas in the 1830s. And the scriptural or the Mosaic geologists were kind of reacting to those conventional ideas that were emerging in geology. The idea of an immensely long history to the Earth, the idea of uniform processes operating at similar scales and intensities and rates, back through the Earth's past. And the scriptural geologists, they had a lot in common with modern creationists. They regarded Genesis as a reliable historical account. Most of them, seemed to accept that the days of creation were normal days. They believed in Noah's flood as a worldwide catastrophe that had formed at least part of the geological record in the crust of the Earth. So these scriptural geologists kind of come along, and who were they? Just to mention a few names, there was, I think the name scriptural geologist comes from the title of a book by George Bugg.
Yep.
There were others, George Fairholme, Granville, Penn. And if you want to read more about them, Terry Mortenson wrote this book. It's actually based on his PhD thesis, The Great Turning Point, and he looks at a number of these scriptural geologists. And they were basically opposed to the long geological ages that were being proposed by Hutton and Lyell. They felt that a very different approach to geology was required that would take into account the reality of creation and particularly the flood. And what was their approach to geology? They basically, I think it would be fair to say that they accepted the facts of geology. So it was just how they felt that those facts needed to be interpreted. So at that time, there was this emerging geological column. Now, we've talked about the geological column in previous episodes, episodes 6 and 7. Mm-hmm. If viewers and listeners want to go back and listen to that, there's this idea that we can reconstruct a kind of idealized order to the rocks and fossils from our observations in the field, that there is an actual succession of rocks. We can work out which ones are older, which ones are younger, and there's a consistent order, a consistent succession of rocks with their enclosed fossils. And I think the scriptural geologists, by and large, accepted the reality of this emerging geological column. It looked a bit different to the column that we're familiar with today. If you open a textbook today and look at the geological column, the column they were familiar with wasn't quite the same, but it was the broad outlines were emerging at that time.
Yeah.
So at that time, the geological column would have been subdivided into these major subdivisions. There were going from the oldest to the youngest. There was the primary, then there was the secondary rocks, and then there were the tertiary rocks, and then there were these superficial deposits called the diluvium. And the primary rocks, the oldest rocks, would have been roughly equivalent to what we today call the Precambrian. The secondary rocks would have been roughly equivalent to our upper Paleozoic and Mesozoic rocks, and then the tertiary rocks, what we would call the Cenozoic rocks. Okay. So there was a kind of broad equivalence.
But I've heard people refer to tertiary still today. That term is still around. Is
yes.
that still technically acceptable to call things tertiary rocks?
Yeah, that term's still around, and it is a kind of holdover from those days. We've sort of lost the terms primary and secondary, but tertiary kind of has hung around.
Okay, cool.
And a bit later on, there was also another subdivision that people referred to as the transition beds that was sort of slotted in between the primary and the secondary.
Right.
Now, nearly all of the scriptural geologists thought that the primary rocks were probably creation week rocks. Most of them thought that way. And that was mainly because they, certainly at that time, were thought to completely lack fossils. A few people actually did put all of the fossil-bearing rocks within kind of creation week, but most of the scriptural geologists thought that the primary rocks, because they didn't have any fossils, they were creation week rocks. So where did they put the flood? Well, almost all of the scriptural geologists thought that the tertiary deposits were flood rocks, which is interesting.
Okay.
A few of the flood geologists put the secondary, or at least part of the secondary, also within the year of the flood. There may even have been one or two, I think, who put the transition beds as part of the flood. But there was a huge amount of disagreement among these guys. There was a paper that was published in the Answers Research Journal by Warren Johns, which you pointed out to me as we were thinking about this episode. And Warren Johns talks about the scriptural geologists, and he has this great chart where he kind of summarizes what the views were of these scriptural geologists about where the flood was in the record. And there's a big range of opinions. So if you think that creationists disagree today, go back and look at the scriptural geologists.
Yeah, it's interesting. His paper there is interesting because you have some scriptural geologists who sort of have a kind of quasi gap theory. As I recall, they mixed in the idea of a recent creation of flood geology with this primordial creation that was destroyed and produced earlier rock layers. So you get a real peculiar mix with these scriptural geologists that's just the lines are more clearly drawn, I think, today in our modern world, where you don't have that strange mix that much anymore. Yeah.
No, they were a really eclectic group of people and had a huge diverse sort of range of views about these things.
Right.
But one of the things that Warren Johns points out in that paper is that over time there were, as you kind of trace the thinking of the scriptural geologists, there was a tendency actually to put the flood higher and higher in the geological column. That's kind of interesting because there's been more of a tendency perhaps in our day to put the flood a bit lower in the column. But they were kind of pushing the flood higher and higher until eventually some of them, many of them would identify the flood simply with this superficial layer, the diluvium, these sort of boulder clays.
Right.
And there were almost otherwise no rock formations that they thought were, flood rocks. And that really almost sowed the seeds of the demise of scriptural geology, because once you'd kind of pushed the flood into just the diluvial layer, what happened is that the diluvium then began to be reinterpreted actually as the products of the Ice Age. It was realized these were glacial deposits.
Right.
These were glacial sediments. And once you kind of put those in the Ice Age, then, your flood rocks have vanished if that's where you're putting the flood. So eventually the scriptural geology movement sort of dies out. It peters out. But these guys, through the period that they were active, and there were a few sort of people who were writing beyond 1860, they were grappling with the same kinds of questions that modern flood geologists are grappling with. And one of those big questions was, where is the flood in the stratigraphic record? And as we've seen, they didn't agree about it. There was lots of opinions.
Now, do you think the disagreement was I mean, there's a lot of reasons there could be disagreement. I suppose one reason could be they were still defining the column while they were doing this, right? So they're still discovering, oh, there's this whole big layer we didn't realize existed. And so they're still developing geology as a science while they're trying to interpret it. I think that's probably part of it. But I think also part of it, I mean, there's sort of in the conventional history of science world, the scriptural geologists are not viewed as real geologists, I would say. I think some who are less ideologically motivated will admit that there were a number of scriptural geologists who had some experience and knew what they were talking about. But a lot of them are basing their ideas off what they're reading in geology. Is that your recollection as well?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there was a huge range of expertise among these guys. So some were actually quite accomplished geologists and knew some field geology. Others were kind of more armchair type geologists, and some of them had geological training and some didn't. And so there's a huge range of expertise. And as you say, there was still a lot of uncertainty, even among conventional geologists, about this emerging geological column. It was still being put together. Right. And so actually, this diversity of opinion is not very surprising, I think.
Right. Yeah. It's weird. I think it's weird for us in the beginning of the 21st century here to think about, it was not that long ago that we knew nothing about the Ice Age. It was not that long ago that people were still unsure of fossils being the remnants of actual living creatures. I think that comes as kind of a shock. At least it came as a shock to me as I started getting into the history of science, realizing that what I took as sort of basic facts about things were, oh yeah, well, this is the product of recent scientific investigation. And so I guess there's no surprise given the range of expertise and the dynamic changing nature of the science that you'd have all these really different opinions.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's pick up the story again in the 20th century. And there we're going to have to deal with one big name who had a really peculiar idea that's quite different. And that person was George McCready Price. Now, Price was he was a teacher. He was one of these, I guess he was just an armchair geologist. I don't think he ever had any real field experience with geology.
No, I think you're right.
Yeah, I think he had. I think he might have had access to fossils and mineral collections, but I don't think he ever actually went out in the field and did his own geological observations, as I recall. And I'm sure knowledgeable viewers and audience members will correct us if I'm wrong, but I think that's right. So, Paul, what was Price's one idea that sort of defined his approach to the flood and the questions about the flood?
Yeah, well, I guess Price's big idea, and this distinguishes him from almost all of the scriptural geologists, is that Price rejected the geological column.
Right.
Price called this the onion skin theory of geology. The idea that there were these successive layers that were found in a consistent order around the world. He insisted there was no order to the rock and fossil layers. It was all a kind of evolutionary conspiracy, that this geological column only kind of existed in the evolutionary imagination. And as you say, he was a self-taught man. He didn't really go out into the field to look at the rocks for himself, but he was a prolific author. I mean, he wrote, I think, about 25 books.
Yeah, something.
And something like that. And his magnum opus was this, published in 1923. The New Geology. It's a kind of flood geology textbook, but it's also a kind of an attack on this onion skin idea of
Right.
geology.
Right.
And Price kind of came along after a time gap. So between the end of the Scriptural Geologists, when the last Scriptural Geologists were writing, and when Price comes along, there's a gap of about 40 years, something like that, when almost nobody, well, I think nobody is writing in defense of flood geology.
There are a few books, but they're not popular.
Right.
They're not well known.
Right.
And the authors are not anybody that you would recognize. I know we have a couple of books about the flood and rocks and fossils in our library at Core Academy, but I think I can count them on one hand. And right now I can't even, I can only remember one. So you're right.
Yeah.
It goes from being every couple of years you'd get a scriptural geology book to nothing, one in 50 years. Yeah. And then Price shows up and starts cranking out stuff left and right.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got this eclipse of the scriptural geologist.
Mm-hmm.
And then Price comes along and he kind of, resurrects this idea of flood geology, but as we were saying, it's quite different to the scriptural geologists in many ways because he's rejecting the geological column. Another thing, now this wasn't an issue really for the scriptural geologists because the glacial theory itself was only being developed at the time the scriptural geologists were writing. But Price rejected the glacial theory as well. He rejected the idea that there had been an ice age that was responsible for these ice age deposits, the boulder clays and so on. And he was drawing there largely on the work of a British author who was a catastrophist. He was a controversialist. He was actually a British member of Parliament, I understand. He was a Conservative member of Parliament between 1886 and 1900, called Sir Henry Howarth. He was not a creationist. He was a believer in an old Earth, but he was vehemently against the idea of the Ice Age. And he wrote a whole series of books. This, I think, was the first, The Mammoth and the Flood.
Ah, yes.
Sir Henry Howarth. And he wrote a couple of other things, including this massive two-volume tome, Ice or Water, and another one which I don't have a copy of called The Glacial Nightmare and the Flood. And he attributed the Ice Age deposits to the flood. He said this is where the biblical account of the flood comes from, and these aren't Ice Age deposits at all. And Price was very influenced by Howarth, and so he rejected the Ice Age too, and attributed those deposits to the flood. So those were two sort of particular distinctives of Price's approach: rejection of the column, rejection of the glacial theory.
So Price then is going to have it's kind of a weird response, because where the scriptural geologists would talk about, well, maybe the secondary, maybe the tertiary, maybe these things were deposited by the flood, and today's creationists talk about things like that as well. Price doesn't have a column to talk about. So for him, all the fossil record becomes a record of the flood. Is that right? All the fossil record is everything? Is flood deposited?
That's basically it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
And he would argue that you could go out in the field and find any layer of rock on top of any other layer of rock, and there was no order at all to any of it. You could just find it anywhere. And the only way you could make an order of it is if you sort of imagined it and imposed it upon the rock record.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so Price had a student named Harold Clark, right? And Harold was teaching at a college in California, and he was teaching Price's geology from Price's book. And one of his students, as the story goes, said to him, "Professor Clark, this can't be right. My dad works in the oil industry and uses the geological column to find oil. So there's no way that what Price is saying is correct." And he invited Harold Clark to come out into the field
Yep.
to examine the rock record for himself. And what happened next?
So yeah, Clark, unlike Price, as you say, decides to go out and look at the rocks for himself. And as I understand it, one of the first things he does is he looks at Yosemite National Park, and he comes to the conclusion there that the glacial theory is correct, that these valleys really were carved by glaciers and so on. They really are indicating the action of ice in the Earth's past. So he begins to question, Price's idea about the Ice Age. He also, as he continues his geological studies and makes these observations, he begins to become persuaded that there is indeed an order to the rocks and the fossils, that the geological column is real, that it reflects something that you can actually see objectively when you go out into the field. And so he starts to sort of take issue with Price on these in these two areas. And in fact, he develops a model that has become known today as the ecological zonation model in order to account for the fossil succession that he perceived in the rocks. And 1946, this is Clark's The New Diluvialism, and he sort of explains this ecological zonation model that he has developed to explain the fossil record in that book. I think Clark also tended to assume that most of the fossil-bearing deposits were the products of the flood.
Yes.
But he seems a little bit uncertain, at least as I read him, exactly where the boundary between the flood and the post-flood occurs. He agrees that the glacial deposits, they're Ice Age deposits, they're post-flood. He thinks that the dinosaur-bearing deposits, they're definitely flood. And somewhere in between those two, there has to be this transition from the flood to the post-flood, but he's not quite sure exactly where that transition occurs. But he puts it in there somewhere, probably with most of the Cenozoic being part of the flood.
Yeah, that's my recollection. He's got that great fold-out diagram there in that book that shows the what he considered to be the different elevation. His model of ecological zonation was based on elevation. So the what we would think of as the Paleozoic, that's his shoreline creatures, and then you move up and you get into the dinosaur territory, and then you finally get up to the higher mountain plateau areas, and that's where the mammals live. And so he in the text he's not quite sure, but in the diagram it seems like he's putting some or all of the Cenozoic into the pre-flood world, where it's going to be deposited as the last of the pre-flood deposits. Well, so let me pick up the story here. He publishes the New Diluvialism, and his teacher is not happy. So he's basically denied two of Price's ideas, the one being that there's no order to the fossil record. Now, Clark has decided, no, there really is, and we creationists ought to generate models and theories to explain the order rather than try to explain it away. And Price basically, I don't want to be too flippant here, but he flips his lid, all right? He goes berserk. He becomes extremely angry with Clark, sends him lots of letters telling him that he needs to change his mind. Clark is unmoved by these letters. Eventually, because they're both members of the same denomination, the same church, Price tries to press the leadership of their church to make a decision between the two of them, and to influence that that process, he publishes a pamphlet about Clarke's ideas that he calls, quote, theories of satanic origin. So he's real subtle here. Yeah, so this campaign goes on for many years. He's very angry with Clarke, and Clarke kind of takes it in stride. He doesn't really react too much, which to his credit I think is quite good. The church leadership, they're just sort of baffled by what's going on here. Why are you bickering over this one issue? It doesn't seem like it has anything to do with you being creationists or you being flood geologists or being consistent with the teachings of our church. This just seems like a minor scientific question that you should deal with. And so they refuse to condemn Clarke for his opinions. They would not go along with Price's campaign. So it was an ugly breach. We only really kind of learned the full depth of it as after these gentlemen passed away and their papers were deposited, and so the public were able to read some of the correspondence and find out what had been going on. But it was not good. Price had essentially decided that his idea about the geologic column being fake was a revelation of prophecy, and that therefore it was unquestionable. It was unquestionably true. And he was unable to persuade anybody that was the case. So there was that breach. But what's interesting about the breach is when Henry Morris comes along to write the Genesis flood, he's adopting a lot of Price's ideas, right? So the idea that there is no order to the fossil record essentially wins, for lack of a better term, right? Clarke's ideas become sort of a niche theory that is not as popular as Price's. So Price's ideas sort of win the day. But then, as I understand it, over the past, whatever it's been, 60 years since the Genesis flood, we have had this gradual, I'd call it gradual, shift away from the Pricean version of no order to the fossil record to most creation geologists that I know would say, yeah, there's an order. There's an order there, and the flood explains the order in some fashion. So it's sort of, the pendulum has kind of swung back, but it took 100 years, probably because there's not very many of us, and we disseminate information slowly, and creationism as a field is like science in super slow motion, I think, sometimes, because there's just so few of us, and we don't have time to do all this work that government-funded scientists get to do, and so it just seems to creep along, but we get there. So here we are back in sort of Clarke's, I would say Clarke's camp. Now, there's still some creationists out there who side with Price. I can think of at least one of them right off the top of my head. And so there's still some tension there, I think, in modern creationists' research. But the days, I think, of widespread popularity of this idea that there is no fossil record, there is no order, is kind of past us. So now we're back to the question of, all right, well, if there is an order, right, like the scriptural geologists thought, then how do we explain the various pieces of the fossil record? Where do we put the flood? What's the recovery of the earth after the flood? And so where's all fit? Now, one thing that I think, and this is not in the outline, Paul, I'm gonna surprise you with this one because it just occurred to me. One of the big developments, I think, is, as we've been talking here, the diluvium, right? So you've got the diluvium, which for a lot of scriptural geologists, that was the evidence of the flood. And then along comes Agassiz, And he does his geological work here in North America, and particularly around Lake Superior, in Canada and the United States, Michigan, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And he comes away saying, look, these rock formations are caused by glaciers. This is what glaciers do. And these rock formations that I observe here, there are no glaciers around, but they clearly look like what glaciers would make. And so, as you said, the glacial theory sort of robs the thunder of all the scriptural geologists and leaves them with no flood. Price comes along, says there is no glacial deposits. Glacial theory isn't real, and the flood caused those deposits. But now, big change is that creationists have accepted, to an extent, we've understood how the glacial model can fit into the flood model of Earth history. Can you speak just briefly to that development? Because I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, so I think creationists have largely come, as you say, to accept that the Ice Age was real. It was a real event, and it was one of the most recent geological events of broad occurrence. And it's usually explained as a kind of after effect of the flood. So during the flood, a huge amount of heat was added to the oceans. So at the end of the flood, the oceans were warm. And when you have warm oceans, you produce lots of evaporation. As the oceans cool down, you get evaporative cooling, and the evaporation, the moisture gets pumped into the atmosphere. And that moisture, there's so much moisture sort of being pumped into the atmosphere from the oceans that you have enormous rates of precipitation in the early post-flood period. And eventually, as the world cools down, this precipitation falls as snow, and it falls so quickly that the summer warmth is not enough to melt the snow that falls each winter. And so you build up ice sheets, you build up thick ice sheets, and you get this kind of snow blitz, across large parts of the mid to high latitudes. And so the Ice Age then is, one of the sort of after effects of the flood. It's part of the recovery of the world after the flood, as the oceans are cooling down and the world is cooling down. And at some point, the oceans cool down to the point where less moisture is being pumped into the atmosphere, and there's kind of a tipping point reached where not enough snow is falling to maintain the ice sheets, and they begin to melt and melt back, and we end up with just the ice caps that we have today.
Right.
So that's kind of how the creationist model today incorporates the Ice Age.
And it's one of those things where, as I understood it, I don't know if this is right or not, but my understanding is that the flood gives us a uniquely suitable mechanism for explaining the Ice Age. The Ice Ages are kind of odd things to happen, and don't really have an adequate explanation, whereas the flood actually provides us with a kind of adequate way of thinking about it. And I know that's highly oversimplified. I know there are climate scientists on the creation side still working on all these questions, and I'm sure we're going to hear about it at the International Conference on Creationism this summer. So I know that there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's a really interesting situation now that the evidence that was supposed to be the flood turned into this Ice Age has now become this thing that creationists say, no, this is something that we can explain really well that you guys have a more difficult time explaining. I think that's pretty neat. And I don't know of anybody in creationism, I'm trying to think, that doesn't accept the Ice Age as a post-flood thing and the Ice Age deposits as post-flood. I suppose there's somebody out there who's got to be ornery.
I have one or two kind of fringy sort of books that still question the Ice Age. So
all right.
Yeah, there are one or two people out there, but nobody well known that Yeah.
So all the ministries that I know of, AIG and CMI and ICR, they all are totally in on the Ice Age. That is part of the widely accepted creation model.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good to know. All right. Well, that sort of brings us up to date. So we've got, on the one hand, nowadays, sort of give people a hint of where this is going to go. We have some folks who still sort of follow Price and Clark and kind of want the flood to be the cause of most of the fossil record, right up until maybe the Ice Age, so that when, Noah and company get off the ark, the world is very similar to what we have it today. There's a few minor differences. There's a land bridge connecting Siberia and America. There's the Ice Age, but otherwise it's pretty similar to what we have. And then you have another contingent of creationists who think that the post-flood ought to extend a little deeper into the fossil record. Some who think it ought to extend quite a bit deeper into the fossil record. And so I think that the consensus is to put it somewhere around what people might think of as the extinction of the dinosaurs. We know it as sort of the KT boundary, the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary that marks the end of the dinosaurs, the beginning of the era of mammals. That's where creationists sort of think that the post-flood begins. And I'm hedging myself here because when I talk to folks about this, they get real hedgy themselves. And I think part of that, if I may speak to this as an outsider, when you read the scripture, right, you read the account of the flood in Genesis, the flood begins pretty abruptly. God shuts the door, Noah and company go in the ark, God shuts the door, boom, it starts to rain. And so there's this onset of the flood that seems pretty well defined. Then things get a little fuzzier, right? You sort of see in scripture this description of a time of prevailing. You have the 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and then you have a time of prevailing, and then you have a time where things, I guess they appear to be a little calmer. And then you see the tops of the mountains. Noah sees the tops of the mountains. The ark runs aground, and he starts sending out the birds to do a little scout work for him. And finally they bring back an olive leaf. So he's realized plants have started to grow. And then sort of what we would think of, I guess, culturally and biologically as the post-flood is when Noah finally opens the door and leaves the ark and lets the animals out again. But as a geological thing, I don't see it suddenly stopping. And so when I think about, when I think about the flood in this debate, I often think about that it seems to me, just reading the Bible, this ought to be a really hard question, I think. And maybe there's going to be deposits that are being deposited technically after Noah's got off the ark, but maybe they look really global. Maybe there's big parts of continents still underwater. I don't know. It just seems to me, reading the text, that I wouldn't say, oh, it's going to be really easy to define this. It strikes me as it's going to be really hard to define this. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I think, we're tempted to kind of visualize the post-flood boundary as this simple line in the rocks, where all the rocks below that point are flood rocks and all the rocks above are post-flood rocks. And I agree. The end of the flood seems much more gradual than the beginning of the flood. And I don't think there's anything in the text itself that that leads us inevitably to the conclusion that the rest of the world is dry simply because it's dry where Noah is and when he's got off the ark.
Right.
And as geologists, of course, how are we going to define that? If we want to define the end of the flood as, Noah leaving the ark, what geological signature does that leave?
His footprint.
Unless his footprint. So unless we have Noah's fossilized footprint, where do we drive the golden spike and say that's when Noah left the ark? I think it's going to be really tough to define. And so it's not a surprise to me. We've talked about these two main positions. You have the creationists who want to put the flood boundary very late in the record, with almost all of the fossil-bearing deposits during the flood. Those who want to put it around the end of the dinosaurs, around the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. But you've actually got lots of other positions too. You've got creationists who want to put it a lot further back than that.
That's right.
I think we're going to focus in this series on those two main positions, because I think a lot of those other positions are held by a minority of, small minority of creationists. So I think we're going to focus on the two main positions. But it's not a surprise, I think, that there is this diversity of opinion given what the text actually tells us about the end of the flood.
Right. And I
think it's going to be hard to define.
Yeah. And we were on Facebook just chatting with some people about this recently, and the question was thrown out. Do you think there could be a different boundary for different places on the earth? That, say, Eocene in one location might be flood and Eocene in another location might be post-flood. And I thought, I don't like that, but I can't really think of a good reason why that couldn't be the case. It just, I suppose, depends on the local conditions of the prevailing floodwaters and how far they've receded and how they've changed things. So, yeah. Interesting puzzles. Now, Paul, I know you are not a neutral observer in this discussion. You have written a paper that went, I think, to ICC. Is that right? The International Conference on Creationism?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you were attempting to outline some things we might think about when we're trying to figure out where to put the post-flood boundary, where to say this is flood rock, this is post-flood rock. Maybe you could, as we reach our last little bit here in this episode, maybe you could walk us through a couple of those that people would understand pretty well. Sort of give us a kind of a preview of the things we might want to listen for as we go through these next couple of episodes.
Yeah, so this is, as you say, not just a kind of academic sort of question for me. It's a kind of personal question because I've sort of been involved in it a bit. And I've actually changed my mind over the years. If you look back at some of the older papers that I wrote, say in the mid-90s, I took a rather different position than the one I do today. So my thinking has kind of shifted a bit. But the paper that you're referring to was a paper with John Whitmore in 2008 at the ICC. And what we tried to do in that paper is to say, well, look, how would we recognize a flood deposit, if we saw it? And so we developed a whole host of criteria, I think almost 30 different criteria that we could apply to any particular local rock section, to try to work out where the end of the flood was. So, for example, we might expect that flood deposits would be deposits where you have fossils of marine creatures in very widely distributed sedimentary layers spanning continents. That seems like something that might characterize the flood.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have more localized deposits that are more confined to basins that perhaps more lake-like deposits or shoreline deposits, reflecting local topography, maybe with land animals in them, that might reflect something that is more likely to be post-flood.
Okay, can we elaborate on that just a little, just a hair? So when you
Sure.
say like a widespread rock layer that is probably flood. Can you give me some kind of sense of scale? What are you talking about? Are you talking about, I don't know, what size are you talking about?
Well,
laterally,
take, for example, laterally. So these might be deposits that span entire continents, and where you can even find equivalents at the same level in the geological column on multiple continents. Okay. So an example might be the Tapete sandstone that we find in Grand Canyon and in the base of Grand Canyon. That's part of an enormous blanket of sand called the Sauk sandstone that you can find right across large parts of North America. And there are similar sandstones at similar levels in the geological column across Europe and Africa and the Middle East and parts of South America. So, it's an enormous sandstone layer on the continents that contains marine fossil.
That's big. That's very big.
That's big.
Right. Yeah. So a local, what would be maybe an example of something that's local? What do you mean by a local deposit?
So maybe something like the Green River Formation in Wyoming, which is a series of deposits that are confined to particular basins. There are a series of basins in that area.
Is it?
So it's all within a part of a single state. Basically, So you're talking about something much more localized, and the distribution of the sediments in those basins is kind of interesting too when you begin to look at the details of the Green River.
Okay.
You see evidence of deeper water deposits in the center of the basin and shallow water deposits around the margins, and you see evidence of footprints of shore birds around the margins and stromatolites that are growing in the shallow water and things like this. So you get a sense that you're talking there about something that's more localized.
All right. That makes sense to me. So yeah, that does seem like it would be something very different in terms of the cause of those kinds of things. You would see if something is covering, say, all of North America, that's a whole different scale of cause than something that covers a couple hundred square miles of Wyoming.
Now, I don't.
That makes sense.
Maybe I'm already beginning here to kind of betray some of my own views about these things. So and I don't want to do that because I don't want to preempt too much what our guests are going to say.
But I think
those are some of the things that we might sort of look for.
Yeah, I think that's a good sense. That gives the audience a good sense of what we mean by scale. That every rock layer is not the same. Some rock layers turn out to be just astonishingly widespread, where you just think this much of the same rock everywhere needs basically a global cause to explain it, whereas this thing over here does not need a global cause. Now, it could be that in the flood, there's some weird conditions locally that produce weird deposits. That's possible.
Yeah.
We can't rule that out. But if you're thinking in terms of sort of the big story, right, I would expect post-flood deposits, because they're not from a global flood, they're going to be more localized. So if there's part of the rock record that's more local in nature, that should be post-flood or maybe late flood. Whereas the stuff at the beginning of the flood, that should be really big and really widespread because it's a global cause that's producing it. So on average, there ought to be a difference. Is there any other ideas that you had there? Any other criteria that you would mention?
Yeah, we listed a whole load, but you might want to look for things like true soils. If you find the development of true soils, that's something that's going to happen after the flood. It's not going to characterize what's going on during the flood. You might want to look at lake deposits. Are there other things that you can identify as the products of lakes? They're probably going to be more common, at least, those sort of localized deposits in post-flood rocks. And So we kind of went through a whole load of these kinds of criteria. We ranked them because some are more important than others, right? Because some of them, there are all kinds of questions of interpretation. How do you actually interpret these things? So when you think about mud cracks, are mud cracks really evidence of desiccation, which might suggest, after the flood, but then mud cracks can form in other ways. Yeah. So you got to be a bit careful about how you interpret these things. But like you say, it's almost a kind of cumulative case. If you have enough criteria that you can apply to a particular locality, you can begin to look at the balance of the evidence, in that region and say, here's where we think the transition is happening between flood and post-flood.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. So you've got your 30 criteria. You're not looking for every one of the criteria to be met.
No.
You're just looking for, okay, well, where do I get a lot of flood criteria? And where does that sort of shift to a lot of post-flood criteria? Because that's probably where that's happening. And it may be, we've already sort of hinted at this, it may be there's a transition zone, right? Where you can't say, this is clearly where the flood stopped. You just have to say, well, it's somewhere around here. Okay, that's. I think that's clear. I think the audience should follow that. So this is going to be an interesting series. We're wrapping up this episode. So thanks everyone for listening.
I'm very excited about this. I'm interested to kind of hear what our guests have to say, and like you say, we deliberately have sort of structured this before we close out. We deliberately structured this so that it's not a debate. We want to give our guests an opportunity to kind of lay out their case and to do it in a kind of calm atmosphere. And hopefully that just means that we're going to get more light than heat. So, we can,
I hope.
Hopefully this can be enlightening. We can all learn something, and maybe it will cause us to change our minds on some things. Who knows? So I'm really interested.
I feel like I'm still enough of a blank slate that I'm pretty impressionable. So we'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll just come out of this as agnostic about it as I am now. Just don't have too strong of an opinion either way. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. We will catch you next time.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.